So today we are talking about characters. It's a little bit of a repeat from a previous webinar that I believe I did in the beginning of the year. I think it was sometime in the beginning of the year. It might have been before the end of 2019, but it's fine. You know, it's good to review. I think it's actually necessary to be going over material again or second or third time, and just to make sure that, we understand what it is that we're doing here. I'm going to try not to be distracted by this very large insect that's flying in my new home. But like I'm saying, it's good to review. So we're going to get into the whole character thing. Before I start, I'll give you just a brief background of who I am, in case some of you don't know. But I'm the Director of Education with the International Screenwriters Association. I created the craft course, which I'm going to give everybody a 50% discount. We're going to continue that discount from last month through this current month in July and through most of August as well. It's only $99 for a self-guided online course called the Craft Course. I created that. So it's $49 for a 12-week course you can use for the rest of your life. So anyway, I'll give a discount code for that later on when we're done here, but I'll follow up with an email as well. Nonetheless, I am the Director of Education. I host some of the ISA's panels that we've been doing on Zoom for the past few months. And I also help manage and run the creative screenwriter development company that we have as a little bit of an offshoot to the ISA. And what that is a slate of projects that we take out to town like producers. Basically, we're trying to set up these projects with different buyers and production companies and studios and things. We have 7 projects on that slate right now. There's no way to just try to get onto that slate unless we find your project somehow, usually through the ISA. And different avenues throughout the screenwriting industry. If you win a bunch of contests and stuff, we'd be happy to take a look. But most of it comes through Felicity Wren and Jaron, who run the development slate. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it's a separate slate of projects that you can technically apply for in a way, but it's through an actual evaluation process. So you pay to receive 5 pages of notes, and those notes are amazing, by the way. And if the reader likes it, then they'll send it up the ranks to Felicity and Jaron for them to consider. But at least you're getting those 5 pages of notes, and I can't tout our readers enough. They really do a great job. They're very thorough. They give some really good notes. So you can find that on the ISA site. Anyway, I also have a consulting company called The Story Farm, where I work one-on-one with writers. I've been doing that since 2016, but technically speaking, in terms of the world of screenwriting, working with writers one-on-one, teaching writers, working in the entertainment industry as any number of other roles from assistant to executive assistant to creative director, blah, blah, blah. I've been doing that since roughly 2005. So 15 years, which is kind of wild. Anyway, so that, I guess point being, you can ask me questions about the industry and the business right now. I'll do my best to answer. You can ask whatever you want in terms of questions. So with that said, so we'll just kind of get started. This is being recorded, so if anybody needs to jump off and they can't finish the whole thing, don't worry about it. It's going to be recorded. We'll put it up on our pro tips and tricks portion of the ISA website. I do believe it eventually ends up on our YouTube channel, which, by the way, you should follow the ISA's YouTube channel. Costs nothing. You can click subscribe and you get little notifications. But there are a ton of videos up there, and some of my previous classes, I think, are up there too. Just a great educational resource. Anyway. So let's just dive into, I want to make it a little different than the last webinar that we had, but I'm sure I'm going to repeat myself, like I said, which isn't a bad thing. But it's kind of needless to say that characters are essential to your story. How to develop them to work within the story that you want to tell, obviously, is much more difficult than just saying characters are important. We all know they are. So how do you get the most out of them? And the issue is that there's just a natural connection to the concept and the story hook that you're trying to present. So sometimes when you come up with a brand new idea, it's usually a little bit of a combination of, I've got this one type of character and they're going to go do this, or there's this setup that I think is really cool, but I haven't really figured out the rest of the story. One way to help you figure out the rest of the story is to look at character first, after you've come up with just a general concept. If you take any movie, and I throw this out all the time, and for those of you who watch my webinars, I've mentioned this before, and I always put this disclaimer out. I don't think this is the greatest movie ever made, but it's entertaining. And because most people at least know of it and the concepts, that's why I use it. But the movie National Treasure came out years ago with Nicolas Cage. The reason I like using that example is because it's a really big idea, and it's just a fun popcorn movie. And you can look at this as an example, meaning the people who came up with this idea probably first came up with the big concept idea, meaning steal the Declaration of Independence, and there is a map to this huge hoard of treasure on the back of the Declaration. That's probably generally where they were when they first came up with the idea. Whoever they were, I don't have those people or names in front of me. Nonetheless, that's probably where they were. From there then, how do you continue to go? Do you continue down the path of, and by go I mean brainstorming, do you continue down the path of all the events that occur, meaning, you know, this problem occurs, they have this major obstacle that happens, and then I know that this is going to happen at the end where they find the treasure, and here's, like, you know, how they, sure, you could go that route, but it's essential, and I think if there's anything you all get out of this webinar is the note of characters drive the action. We don't want to rely on passive characters where things are just happening to them all the time. Even if you see movies like a 40-Year-Old Virgin, which I use that example a lot too, because it's just a really easy hook. But that technically, in terms of Steve Carell's character, is a pretty passive character because he's being thrust into situations and he's just sort of reacting to them. But even if in that example, you notice, even in that example, you notice that he does start to take action. He buys into what his guys, his buddies, or his friends are trying to do a little bit. And he's like, okay, I'm gonna go try to do this. And so we still had a character making decisions and going through the motions at least for and with his friends. So we can't, and I don't wanna say don't, because there are always exceptions to the rule where you have a completely passive character and everything just happens to them. You don't see those stories very often. The easiest route and the more usual route is to have a character that is active in pursuing something. And that is key as well. So not only do we want that note of characters drive the action, but it's in pursuit of something. Whatever that something is, there is some level of a goal for that character. And here's another example that I use a lot because, again, most people at least know of it or have seen it, but When Harry Met Sally, in a way, that story, which is, I think, so brilliant, and Nora Ephron is just one of the greatest ever, but those characters are unconsciously seeking something, right? Harry wants to find and have love, but then his goal changes when he gets a divorce and he meets Sally, and now he's terrified of commitment. So he actually, what he's wanting is to not have a relationship, right? He's trying to stay away from it. That's much more nuanced than of course, Nicolas Cage in National Treasure, where it's obvious, find the treasure. You know, that's what they're pursuing, and then all the steps along the way. So going back to what I was previously saying, if you come up with a story idea, map on the back of Declaration of Independence, instilling and installing, whatever the right word might be, the best particular character to go on this adventure to then find the treasure will naturally start to bring up this level of an emotional journey on top of just the cool factor stuff, the hook, the basic plot of this needs to happen. So, and needs to happen, I mean, a goal achieved. Because technically speaking, especially in When Harry Met Sally or National Treasure, you could put any character within those plot devices, right? The actual hooks of the story, you can put anybody in there. But if you put a different character in place of Nicolas Cage, it could be somebody who is evil or, you know, cruel or has extremely selfish intentions. He doesn't care about anybody else. He just wants the treasure. It turns into a much different story, and then we have to learn how to pull for that hero. There still needs to be some reason why we're hoping he does find the treasure. Instead, they put somebody in that role to give just a little bit of an emotional reason for finding the treasure. Granted, it's not exactly a heavily layered concept. It's a pretty basic idea, but he's going after the treasure not because he wants to make a whole bunch of money, but because he's trying to correct the history of his family name, where everybody thinks they're just a bunch of hacks, right? So he's trying to prove that his name is worthwhile, his last name and his father's last name and grandfather's last name, that they're not crazy. They want to prove themselves correct. That then automatically turns the story into a more emotionally impactful journey. Again, this isn't, we're not talking about an Academy Award-winning screenplay or anything, but you can at least see what I mean there. With When Harry Met Sally, there's this still relative approach of seeing an emotional goal that sometimes the characters don't necessarily know. Harry and Sally know that they don't want to be alone for the rest of their lives. They don't necessarily know they want to be together with each other. And that's the difference of genre, right? A romantic comedy can do that, where they are pursuing certain things, etc., but they don't necessarily know that they were actually pursuing this. And that's a big portion of the next note in character development, is understanding the difference between the character's want and the character's need. So want versus need. At the beginning of virtually every single story, a character is wanting something, whether they're actively pursuing it or just living in their life. This is probably the first 10 pages of the script. They want something, they desire something. They don't necessarily yet know how to get it or achieve it, but they want it. We get a glimpse into the desire of this character. We then can look at things structurally, which I'll go into, because certain things can occur that allow them to start pursuing this, but nonetheless, still staying in a bird's eye view, that need starts to become apparent based on the emotional impact of the plot that is occurring. Sounds a lot easier said than done, but that's the difference between emotional structure and basic logistical structure, a plot structure. Nicolas Cage in National Treasure, these are the little checkpoints we need to hit where they're going to go solve this clue, they're going to solve that clue, they're going to get here, blah. That's basic, just here, let's put them at different spots, right? But what carries us to those spots is the choices the characters are making based on what's going on inside of them emotionally and how, deep that need is. We'll use another character as an example, and this is flipping it a little bit, because I use the example of we have a plot-oriented idea that pops up, right? We have a map on the back of the Declaration of Independence that shows us where the treasure is. For a movie like Shrek, which I'm assuming all of you have seen, Shrek is a movie about a character. The magic of the movie, of course, is the world within which we have placed Shrek, all the fun fantasy stuff that comes into play that really just kind of adds to the fun and comedy of it all. But ultimately, that's actually a very personal story for Shrek. And because of the movie is titled his name because of how unique he is. And you see that a lot. Any movie or TV show that is titled a character's name is usually because that character is the most unique element of the concept that we've come up with. And so we name it Shrek, like the TV show that it's on one of the streamers. I think it's on Amazon, Hannah. Hannah is a very unique character because we haven't seen that age of a girl being basically a professional killer. There's a lot more to that story than that, but nonetheless, we're taking then the brainstorming approach of, I have this extremely unique character. We haven't really seen an ogre who just wants to be left alone before, who lives in this fantasy world. So you then come up with a story to suit him, right? What can we do to get the emotional flaw? That term kind of annoys me because it's just too open-ended, but nonetheless, what can we do for Shrek to help him change and evolve? And that ultimately goes for any story being told. And that doesn't necessarily mean every single story needs to have a main character completely arc and change. There isn't, every single story fitting this need of the characters one way in the beginning, and by the time they get to the end, they're completely different. We don't need to do that. What we do intend or hope to do is allow the audience to have an experience from an emotional and visceral level of seeing this character evolving in some way, becoming somewhat better, or learning something even just a little bit by the end, so that the audience can have that experience too. So that also goes to another primary point and note of the audience is going to be experiencing the plot and concept and hook, whatever you want to call it, through the perspective of the main character, or maybe not perspective, but through the experience of the main character. That's who they need to be connecting with. Whether it's a direct, yes, I see myself being like that person, or even in the Fast and Furious movies, no one can connect with any of those characters, but we might want to. I'm actually not a big fan of the Fast and Furious movies just because that isn't really my style, but they're extremely popular and I can totally understand why people would love them because they're fun. But the characters in that movie have no way that most of the population of the world can actually connect personally with those characters, but most of us can say we want to in some way, right? So there's still a connection. Point being, starting to go off on a tangent, but we want to be presenting, I'm kind of going back to my initial point of when you first have a general story idea, you want to consider, did I come up with the idea because I know the character's really unique and cool? Or did I come up with the idea because I think the situation and the hook and the concept's really cool and I'm excited about that? It doesn't matter, like one isn't better or more popular than the other. You just want to be able to differentiate, because that can then start your brainstorm process from a rooted place, right? There's a foundation there of like, okay, cool. I don't have an incredibly unique character, which is fine. You don't need one. Of course, it helps to have one who is at least layered. But then instead I have this plot and a situation that's actually pretty cool. I want to dive into that. But the way to do that is to combine the two. So no matter what, you're combining the concept with the character. And I think that's an important point to make here, that character development is not just journal entries about who this person is and their backstory. That, of course, helps. And I have some exercises that you guys can do to just get to know your character a little more. But it's impossible to have a concept without a character, and it's impossible to have a character without a concept. You don't have anywhere to put them. So point being, and I think I've said that a couple times, you want to be coming from a place of character drives the plot and action. That then means, let's make sure I know as much about my character as possible. And by character, I'm saying our one main character. I know that there are ensembles out there. I know that there are big casts. Even of course in TV, you have multiple players. More often than not, we're going to have one character that's a little bit more of the main character than others. So I'll just kind of make that disclaimer. If you have a true ensemble, like a Big Chill, which is a pretty old movie at this point, you don't really have a lot of ensembles nowadays. But it's also because, like a Love Actually is a good example of an ensemble. You have more work to do, a lot more work to do in ensemble, and you really have to have a strong understanding of structure when it comes to working in this realm of an ensemble cast, because each of those characters are their own main character, and they each have a secondary character who helps them go through their journey in some way. They each have goals. They each have different paths that they're going down. So you're technically writing like 3 or 4 different movies, so-called, in the one movie, because they all have to end up somewhere, right? A lot more work to do. And it's kind of the same way for a TV series. It's just that not all characters are created equal. And I guess you could argue the same for a feature ensemble, but nonetheless, I just wanted to put that in a disclaimer out there. During this webinar, we're talking about much more of a main character oriented journey. So from there, we have a main character, we have a basic plot concept. I use this word a lot, and here's a big one that you want to just mark down: situation. We've all heard that word. It sounds like I'm saying something you never heard of before. But when put into the context of brainstorming for a feature or a TV series especially, the word situation, for me anyway, helps me make sense of what I have from a story concept, from a story hook. Because not only in general for an entire series idea for TV, we'll say, you have an ongoing and overall situation, right? You have, you can come up with literally any TV show and look at it. I'm trying to think of something that I mean, you call them a sitcom because it's a situational comedy. Each episode is a different situation, but with the same characters. But it's situationally oriented. You want a new situation that I can put these same characters in every single week, and it's the characters that are driving the situations, right? Because I want to see these characters from the Big Bang have these various experiences in different situations, while some of it might be serialized. If you have a show like Stranger Things, it's very situationally oriented, and those characters are, of course, driving the situation, but not just the main character. It's a villain or an opponent oriented situation. The opponent, the bad thing, has created the situation, kidnapped the kid, their friend, and now the guys have to go and find their friend. Every single episode then is dealing within that situation. It's just an evolved version of the situation every episode because it's serialized. You get new pieces of information. The characters have new problems. So situation is very concept driven, meaning it's plot stuff. But it can also be character oriented because the characters are learning about who they are within that situation that they find themselves in. And it's not just from an overall bird's eye view, whole, TV series idea or feature idea. You also have situations per episode, and you have situations per scene. So the word situation helps me just have an understanding of there's conflict in a situation, there's some drama in a situation, there's potential comedy because of look at the situation I'm in. So that word helps me at least just start to brainstorm from a more specific place as opposed to I have a scene or I have an act, you can break it down. Vernacular is important. So that being said, we've got, looking at it from a TV side of things, a situation is your idea. That's your hook, right? You want to look at any TV show that's on TV right now, consider what the ongoing situation is, which I have another term for called recurring moment. Same basic thing, but it's this ongoing moment and experience that the audience will have when they're watching your show or watching your movie. In the movie Liar Liar with Jim Carrey, you're going to be seeing, even just from the pitch and emphasis on seeing these visuals, of a lawyer unable to tell a lie for 24 hours. And we're going to see that moment over and over and over and over again. It's a recurring moment. Some ideas have a much more natural and easy approach to the hook, which is the recurring moment, like a Liar Liar, where it's just much more hooky, high concept. But generally speaking, every single idea does have a sense of a recurring moment. If you have a murder mystery, like Knives Out, you know that this recurring moment is that we have a death that occurred and all these people are being interviewed and to find out who did it. We have this weird police officer who's British but speaks with like a Southern accent. But Daniel Craig is trying to figure out who killed the people. That's your recurring moment. That's your situation. But then you can start to layer things in like, well, I've got somewhat of a main character in the housekeeper and it's her mystery that's going to be unfolded. That's an idea. That's something that the writers or producers came up with. Like, okay, well, from what perspective do I tell this story? What's going to make it a little different? That's really what I'm trying to say in terms of a level of brainstorming from a character place. So let's just say, and I see a question pop up in the Q&A, I'll get to that in a second. Let's just say you've got your basic concept down. Now you know, based on just this class or natural writing storytelling ability, that you want the characters to drive the action. There are some exercises that you can do, and I think I've gone through these before. I know I work with my writers through Story Farm with this little exercise, but it's fun because it isn't something, you can do handwritten versions of this, or you can type it up, whatever you want. But I call it scenes and moments and windows breakdown. You want to try to come up with 50 scenes and moments for at least your main character. Hopefully you also do it with the secondary character and your opponent, and I'll go into the differences with those people. But you just want to come up with a list of a sentence or two description of a scene or moment or a line of dialogue that defines and presents this character's inner struggle, emotional flaw, personal issues, you know, the things that are holding the character back from being the best version of themselves. Because that's ultimately what any story is trying to do. We're trying to put a character within a situation that allows them to evolve through difficulty and obstacles to become even just a little bit better than they were. There are some movies, because I know a lot of people are thinking, well, but this and this. There are some movies like A Requiem for a Dream where the characters are even worse off by the end. Those are kind of statement movies or statement stories. They're showing this movie, Requiem for a Dream, to say drugs are bad. Don't take drugs. And here's what can happen. And so after you're done watching that movie, you're like, I'm not going to take drugs. This is awful, you know. And so it's kind of a point-making movie, or like I said, a statement movie. So of course, there are exceptions to the rule. More than often than not, you're going to have a character be a little bit different or completely different by the end. So what you want to do is come up with a list, and I'm saying on the left side of the page, you can have two different documents here, but on the left side of the page, you've got a list of scenes and moments that, and maybe a line of dialogue or two that present who this character is personally, their emotional flaws, scenes that put this character up against their flaw, meaning, let's say someone's extremely risk averse, they're terrified of everything, but they're thrust into an extreme sports contest. Now, almost every single scene that character is in, they're going to have to face their flaw of being so risk averse. They don't want to take any chances. They're terrified of heights, you know, all the different things that come into play. So that's what I mean. You want to be able to have an understanding of what's going on inside this character that is holding them back, what's not allowing them to be the best version of themselves. So you want to try to list 50 of those. On the right side of the page, you want to present 50 windows into who the character is. So it's like a view into who the character is without relying on an actual moment or a line of dialogue or an interaction with the character. They're just visuals we're going to see, like the types of clothes the characters wear, the type of lamp on their bedside table, the posters on the wall, the car they drive, as many of those things as possible. Whether you actually present and show these brainstorm lists in the script doesn't matter. It's just so you get a sense of who this character is. And this is all before you get into the structural writing, trying to beat things out, trying to write summaries. Because what happens is when you start to look at your characters in that way, where you just come from a scene level of ideas, brainstorms, based on the flaw, meaning I'm going to put a character in a situation, even just through a scene, that is going to make it difficult for them, you know, either physically or emotionally. Now you start having all of these scene ideas, and you don't necessarily know where they're going to occur or happen in the script from a structural standpoint, but you can see your movie now, right? All based on just character stuff. Now, when you start looking at those brainstorms and then put some of those within the concept, which even when you're making your list, you're going to naturally be thinking of the concept and the plot. But once you start placing them, just again, it doesn't have to be structurally, but within the realm of what you're trying to figure out from a plot standpoint, you start to see the story unfold without ever having to write an outline or anything. So this is all just from a character level of brainstorming. I'll use an example for my little young adult fantasy novel that I wrote a few years back called The Wish Keeper. It's about a fairy with shredded wings who can't be a particular type of a fairy called a wish keeper. She's the only one that can't fly. She's got a literal chip on her shoulder. And so I just went down the list of all these different ideas based on the emotional situation Shay, the main character, is in. She's 16, she's frustrated, she's resentful, she doesn't take no for an answer, she's determined to prove to everybody that she's good enough. So from all those levels of just personal flaw type of issues, I can then start deriving scenes from them. And so as an example, I had one of my lists on the 50 of scenes or moments. I knew that I wanted her to say the line, "Who's going to grant my wish?" I built this whole world around the wishing process. I don't need to go into the plot. But I knew I wanted her to say that to somebody and be really angry about it. I had no idea where it was going to happen or who she was going to be saying it to, but I knew that I wanted that line. I wanted that moment where she's yelling at somebody, who's going to grant my wish. So it's that type of moment. I could see a scene even though it wasn't fully developed. So from there, like I said, that'll start putting you into a place where, okay, I don't know the structure of it yet, but I can see how the situation goes beyond just a setup. And this is where I'll get into some of the structural notes. Because what I notice more often than not when looking at pitches or log lines, listening to pitches, more often than not, the pitches that need some work or development are because of the writer not quite going beyond just the setup of the idea. You know, they like for National Treasure. No, that's not a good example. Well, I don't have one on the top of my head, but basically, a writer coming up with an idea that only references the presentation of the new opportunity for that main character. So I don't want to jump ahead of myself, but let's say we'll use Star Wars as an example. Luke Skywalker's parents are killed by, you know, the Empire. I'm not going to go into all the details. And he meets this old kind of wizard-like man who says you are a Jedi, and so he sets off to be one. That's like a quarter of the story at most, right? There's so many other things that go on within the second act of that story. So we want to be moving from a pitch level when we get into this structural brainstorming, which obviously involves character. We want to get beyond the setup event, the new opportunity presented to the character. We want to be focusing on what happens in the second act. What is the recurring moment this character is going to experience within the context of the plot, but it'll also be a test of that main character's flaw. So that's why the list of all these different moments and scenes and lines of dialogue that are going to be presenting just flaw-related moments, whether it's a full scene or just a moment, will then help you see what my recurring moment might be. And to kind of use this risk-averse example again, I knew that, and this is an idea that I brainstormed and developed years ago, a movie never went anywhere. So now I just use it as part of my lesson plan, which could be a good or bad thing. But I knew I wanted to tell some form of a Holy Grail story. That was my first inkling of a brainstorm. I had no idea what I wanted to do. So I started to write this really dramatic, like, mystery behind the Holy Grail and the real story behind Mary Magdalene and Jesus Christ and all this historical stuff. Did all this research. And a book comes out called The Da Vinci Code. And I was like, he did it quite a bit better than I could. So I scrapped the really, you know, dark historical context of the idea. And I'm like, well, I still have the Holy Grail. So I came up with a comedy, an adventure comedy based on somewhat of, you know, a reveal of the Sword of Excalibur and the Holy Grail and all that stuff. But where it really started to take off was where I asked myself, and really this was even separate from the brainstorm of the Holy Grail Excalibur story. I asked myself, what if I personally was forced to, you know, jump out of an airplane with a parachute on, or, you know, go down white water rapids in, you know, some kind of kayak. And I'm a pretty risk-averse person, and I would probably have fun doing the rafting, you know, but it would still terrify me. So I just kind of went from that place, and I said, let's exaggerate it to a point of where this guy is terrified of everything, almost so much that he doesn't like leaving his house. And he's forced onto this extreme sports adventure. And so it was a totally separate brainstorm, all based on character. But I knew I had this idea of Excalibur, Holy Grail, and what can I do with that? And so I merged the two ideas, where the little extreme sports adventure contest married the two. So at the end of this little contest, kind of like almost a reality show idea for the contest of, you know, an extreme sports thing, they would find like a fake Holy Grail or whatever, you know. And that was where the idea came from. But it was because I was marrying, I knew I wanted to tell an idea about Excalibur, but I also wanted to get this character in here because I know putting a really risk-averse character within these wild situations will just be fun to see over and over and over again. Because I knew I needed a really strong recurring moment. And otherwise, the audience is just going to get bored in that second act. And the second act is, what, 70 pages of your script at least? 60 to 70? So from there, we'll go into a little bit of a structural breakdown, because I think that'll help everyone see and understand how we can use some of these brainstorms. Let's just answer a question here. Okay, so we're going a little off topic, and then we've got an anonymous question too. Good. Roger's asking, I had a winning short that I attempted to make into a full story. Last month I had an ISA evaluation. I was surprised to get a poor score. I'm going to take it back to a short. What advice would you give to get back to my tight little winning story? I do want to keep the main idea and character. Okay, so obviously I haven't read the short, and I don't have all of the information about the story. For one thing, I do want to say, don't base your ISA development evaluation too much on the score. It's really about the notes and what the reader is saying in terms of, here's what I, the reader, might be thinking of ways to elevate the project and idea. Focus more on the notes. The score itself, obviously it's an indicator, so I don't want to lessen the importance of it. But to give you an example, I think, just from my knowledge, I don't manage the development slate. I think we've over the past 3 years, had, I think, 5 or 6 projects receive higher than a score of 80. So it isn't really like on a scale of 100, you got a D. It's not that simple. It's not like there's this really confusing math involved either. But out of the thousands of evaluations we've given over the past 3 or 4 years, I literally think maybe 5 or 6 people have received a score of 80 or higher. So I wouldn't worry too much about the score. So with that being said, let's say, I was surprised to get, I'm going to be back to a short. What advice would you give to get back to my tight little winning story? So it can be difficult trying to expand a short story into a feature, or a novel or whatever, something long form, because sometimes an idea only works as a short story. And it's totally okay. Like, you don't have to try to force it to be a long form story. But the reason it sometimes works well as a short form story is because the situation itself is kind of defined. Like it doesn't necessarily go toward this level of an entertaining recurring moment. I can see this moment happen over and over and over again. And that comes into play a lot in the TV world, where producers, you hear a lot of people asking, does it have legs? And that really is just meaning, can this moment, in this same situation, last for 4, 5, 6 seasons? Because that's where the production companies and studios will actually make their money if you have a long form series. Sometimes an idea just doesn't allow for a recurring moment that's ongoing, which is fine. It's like, okay, I just have to accept that. Or you have to get in there and go, okay, what's the core unique element of my short? What is it that the character pursues from a goal-oriented level? Can I stretch that out over a long-form series or feature? And will it still remain entertaining if we see this situation become repeated over and over and become, hopefully, elevated and evolved as it goes? So it's kind of going along lines of what I'm saying here, Roger, as far as character brainstorming and looking at how your character can fit within a plot situation or idea that you have, and asking the question, is it going to be fun to see this character do the same thing over and over again? Obviously, it isn't literally the same thing over and over again, but seeing Jim Carrey unable to tell a lie for 24 hours, it's going to be pretty fun. I don't think everybody has a hook that easy, but you do want to try to get your idea to that place of what is the unique element that repeats itself and it's still fun and entertaining to watch. So that's what I would ask, yourself anyway, about this story idea. You want to keep the main idea and character. And again, sometimes maybe the short just doesn't last into a longer form, and it's totally okay. And there's nothing you've done wrong. It's just, that's the idea. I hope that helps a little bit. Just write the story you want to write, but obviously consider the audience's experience. If we're going to go into a long form, first, second, third act of a feature, it has to continue with that fun repeating moment. How do you discover or develop the core of your character? So the core, that's a term that I don't always use. It's kind of along the lines of, Jen Grisanti uses a term like the wound, but you really have to treat your character development and brainstorming process like you're sitting them down on like a psychiatrist's couch, and just ask them questions. And you can Google questions, like questions to ask my character for development or whatever. And you'll see so many different things pop up, like, oh, all these different questions. Who am I? Where did I come from? Who hurt me in my past? What do I wish? What do I desire? What can't I have? And why do I believe I can't have? Like all these different questions. And those are just fun journaling exercises that you can make. This thing, oh, he's trying to get out. I almost feel bad for him. That was probably funny to see. That wasp is, he isn't attacking me, thank God. But just a whole bunch of questions to ask. It's almost like you're asking yourself, what's my flaw? What's holding me back from, you know, becoming the most amazing person ever, or the best version of myself? Just ask a ton of questions of who that person is. And that person will start to materialize in a much more broadly, you know, scoped way. And you don't necessarily have to be asking questions based on the concept of your idea. It's just this one character. It's kind of like in playing Dungeons and Dragons. I don't know if anybody ever played D&D. I played a few times and nothing, and I never really got into it. But I played, I think, maybe 3-4 years ago, and I realized this is just character development. It really is just character development, because you're rolling the dice to see, you know, what levels of dexterity and physical ability, and you're building your character and then placing them in a situation. It's just storytelling. So that would be my best answer to that, to just ask your character as many questions as you can, figure out what's at the core of what they want. There's a level of desire. If you don't have a character wanting something in your story, you don't have a story. Otherwise, you know, like, why are we watching? They want something, whether it's purely external, plot-based, or if it's something really internal. You have to figure out what it is that they want. Then come to a place of, well, they actually need this, and that's where theme becomes stated and presented, because that's where message and a lesson is given to the audience because the character learns that lesson. Sometimes it's overt and obvious, like in a Pixar Disney movie, where, you know, Marlin is hanging on the tongue of a whale and Finding Nemo, and Dory screams at him, "You have to let go." You know, and sometimes theme is directly stated, because that's the whole point of Marlin's journey. He has to let go. And now let's put him into situations that show how difficult it is for him to let go. Get his kid, kidnapped by a fisherman. Now we have a whole story where we're going to see a recurring moment about a father who's unable to let go of his son growing up ultimately and letting him just be on his own. Granted, this is an extreme way to do that, but that's a movie. You know, like, why are we writing a story unless it's somewhat elevated than, compared to real life? Let's see, Victoria, I'm developing an ensemble TV series, and I'm wondering how many characters can be part of the main friend group before it gets too complicated. Let's see. Developing an ensemble TV series. So ensemble, Victoria, it's tricky, but it's a TV series, so it's doable here. But I'm wondering how many characters can be part of the main friend group before it gets too complicated. Well, there's one little, to directly answer the question, and it's not easy to give a direct answer because this could be a whole webinar just about developing a TV series with an ensemble cast. But one general rule I remember hearing in college even, I think one of my screenwriting teachers mentioned this, but she said, generally speaking, an audience member, us just watching a show or a movie, can really only remember up to maybe 4 character names well. Like, I know who those people are, at most. Look at Game of Thrones. I think I went through, all the seasons, there were like 7 or 8 of them. I think I remember 4 names. There were so many characters in that movie. And if you start reading a list of the characters, you're like, oh yeah, right, that person, right, and you start remembering. So you don't want to go too over the top, especially if you have a relatively simple TV series idea. Game of Thrones is far from simple. Nonetheless, they might be able to remember up to 4 names. So you want to try to keep, that's why you see a lot of these sitcoms having 3, 4, maybe 5 characters at the core, right? You had Jerry, Elaine, Kramer, and George. How many other names of people do you really remember in that show? If you're lucky, and if you're a Seinfeld fanatic, you might be able to remember 2 or 3 more. Soup Nazi doesn't count because it's like a whole other thing. But anyway, that's one little rule, Victoria. I'd be careful with really going beyond the whole scope of 3 or 4 people. But main friend group, it's really also about, can I tell the story that I want to tell with this, fewer amount of characters. Almost all the time you can. You don't need 7 people to present, this TV series about dating. Like the show on Netflix, Sex Education, there's probably, 4 or 5 core groups of characters there. I shouldn't say groups of characters, but 4 or 5 characters who then have side characters that are also, supporting them or conflicting and, or, opposing them. The biggest issue with a TV series, kind of like writing an ensemble for a movie, which I said earlier, is that every single character has their own storyline. There's going to be one character whose storyline is a little bit more directly related to the concept and hook of the show. With Sex Education, the main character becomes, or just kind of makes himself, a school counselor and psychologist on the sexual issues of the students in the school, and they pay him for advice. That's the general TV series hook, right? That's what we're going to see in some form or another every single episode. That's where we want to be from a brainstorming level of plot, right? We want to come up with an idea that, every single episode, it's this situation. Then you can start looking at all these other characters, side stories, B story, C story, D story, E story. I tend to call them, going back to this word, A situation, B situation, C situation, because it just helps wrap my brain around the idea of every single character has an ongoing situation they are in, that they find themselves in. Like the main character in Sex Education, he finds himself in a situation of, I'm in love with my business partner, the person that is helping him run this little psychologist counseling business. That's the situation. Then you have one of his best friend, the kid who is dealing with, homosexuality, and, he's got multiple situations off of just that situation because his parents don't necessarily agree and they're kind of hard on him. And then you've got this bully in school. And then, he's got this really close friendship with the main character, but it's not romantic. Like, there are so many things that fall off of that. So you have all of this work to do, and I apologize, I have a lawnmower outside, but you have all of these other situations that fall from the primary situation. So when I have an ensemble TV series, I'm like, let's be careful, because you may be creating more work for you. Focus on what's my series hook. What am I going to see overall from a concept level every episode? Now let's look at the characters that can help present what I'm trying to say thematically. Hopefully that helps, Victoria. It's a really good question. It causes for, a much bigger answer. Is character development the reveal of character throughout the story? Good question. The term character development, it can mean a lot of different things. Generally, if I were lazy Lori, I would just say yes. That's the general question or answer. But I think the word development is important from 2 different angles, right? Development meaning brainstorming, asking all these questions, making all these lists, and developing your character. And then in the story, you're seeing an ongoing development of that character based on what you want your character to become by the end, either emotionally or literally or whatever. So I try to use the word evolution when looking at character development from a story standpoint, when you're actually telling your story. And then character development as a brainstorming tool, just to help differentiate. But basically, yes, Larry, that is. By the way, where are you in Wisconsin? I'm with our kids in Cascade near Plymouth. Beautiful weather today, so it's a nice little tangent. I don't know where Cascade or Plymouth is. I'm in the southeastern part of the state, so anything north of Madison, north of even Green Bay and north of there, it's like a whole other territory. It's beautiful up north in Wisconsin. And it is. It's a very nice day in southeastern Wisconsin. But let me think. There are so many other things I could go into with character development, and an hour probably doesn't really cut it. But I wanted to go into structure, and I'll talk about that just a little bit because we have a little bit of time left. But I come from a place of, and this is technically a whole other webinar, but a place of looking at story from a sequential order of things. And this is talking about logistical structure, not the emotional, ups and downs of the character experiencing these obstacles and the emotional difficulty of that. Emotional structure is much more kind of, woo-hoo, and there isn't like a definitive order of things. With the logistical structure, that's when you're looking at, well, by page 29, this should be happening. all that stuff is just kind of formula. It's fine. And we should know the formula so that we can break it and change it. Art itself should not be formulaic. And so that's why people kind of go, oh, I don't like this term formula. But just generally speaking, when we're dealing with a screenplay that, you know, if you're trying to write a network show, they should be between 57 and 61 pages. You're forced into a formula. Like what? you have no control over that. Anyway, from a structural standpoint, and I'll try to get through this relatively quickly. I come from a place of sequences, and I know Chris Soth, what does he call himself, like the $1 million screenwriter or something, but Chris is great, and there are a whole bunch of other consultants that have different aspects of act breaks. How many acts are there? How many sequences are there? Chris, I think, comes from like an 8 sequence approach or maybe 10 sequences. I take a 12 sequence approach. It's just because it helps my brain a little bit more, where there are 3 sequences in the first act of a feature, 6 in the middle, second act, 3 again in the third act. It's just, it really doesn't matter. You can do however many you want, but taking that approach of 12 sequences, meaning if every single sequence, it's not, but if every single sequence was 10 pages, you'd have a 120-page script. Please, everyone listening, don't write a 120-page script. Just don't. Readers in town are going to see that and go, this person hasn't developed or, you know, tightened up the script. People are now looking for 110 maximum. Unless you're a known screenwriter, you're a Quentin Tarantino, who you know you're going to develop or direct your own stuff. You're Shane Black, who wrote Lethal Weapon. All these top-notch A-list writers can do whatever they want because they know that writer has proven him or herself, and she can do whatever she wants. So I don't use that as an example. Quentin Tarantino wrote a 219-page script. I don't care. He knew he was going to go out and direct the thing, so it's not an example. 110 pages or less. For a horror script, there are certain things where it's like, yeah, if you can get it under 100, that'd be great. Romantic comedy, you know, the general number, you probably want to be 100 to 105 pages. That's really kind of the sweet spot for, you know, a new writer, unless you are able to get something in the 97, 98, 99 range. Don't use that as, you know, Bible verse necessarily. Maybe that's not the best way of saying it, but don't write 120 pages. Nonetheless, 10 pages per sequence roughly. And so the first 3 sequences make up that first act. Each sequence has a particular point of existence, meaning this should be happening in this sequence generally. This should be happening then in sequence 2. Sequence 3 has this generally happening. It's just a way to see the flow of a story in a general sense. As an example, and my craft course goes through this in extreme detail, but sequence 1 is main character stage of life. We're presented who this character is now, present day type of stuff, even if it's in 1789 or whatever. Current character stuff. They're dealing with these life issues. They're about to have their 16th birthday. They were just fired, or, you know, they're extremely happy and they love their life and there's nothing wrong, whatever. Main character stage of life, we get to see who this person is. The second sequence is the setup event or series of setup events. So it's when Steve Carell is forced into this opportunity of his friends saying, we're going to get you laid. It's the new opportunity that the character is presented. Opportunity for Steve Carell at the time is like, this is not an opportunity. I don't want to do this. Technically speaking, based on the character's need of having these experiences of growing and really finding out what it is you're afraid of so you can grow, it was an opportunity. It just didn't seem that way to him in that character. The third sequence is the secondary character introduction, which doesn't necessarily have to happen in the third sequence. We may meet the secondary character, which is like the second lead early on. But the third sequence is the presentation of, okay, me being secondary character, here's how I'm going to affect you. And then so on and so on and so on. And every sequence has a point, meaning this should be happening, generally speaking, within this sequence. From all the character brainstorms we were talking about, the scene listing and the moment listing, the windows, and then considering what your recurring moment is going to be for that character to experience in the middle of your story. Now you can start placing some of these ideas sequentially, and it doesn't feel like such a linear approach to your writing, right? You're not just sitting down with a blank draft, a final draft in front of you and going, well, let's just go. And you don't necessarily know where you're going. I mean, you're going to get to 35 pages in and you're just going to stop and then start on something else. So taking a non-linear approach to brainstorming and developing your story is going to help. As I was going through that, I realized I didn't get into secondary character or the opponent. Pretty straightforward stuff, but there are a lot of nuances that come into play, especially per the genre. Like in a romantic comedy, the opponent may begin as your secondary character, or may begin as a secondary character and turn into an opponent. They can be both. And in some genres like Disney movies, you're going to have a villain instead of an opponent, and there is a difference. So anyway, I could go on and on, but we're kind of coming up at the end of the time here. Let's see if there are any other questions. Let's see. What about single isolated character who has to show thoughts through voiceover a lot? Voiceover is tricky, and that could be a very long answer to your question, Mark, but I mean, you look at Castaway, it's a literal single isolated character movie, didn't rely on voiceover, and we didn't need it. So I think the biggest question is, do you need voiceover? More often than not, I see voiceover misused because the writer thinks they need to make sure the audience understands things. So they try to tell them. And I completely understand the urge. But we as audience members are so well experienced in watching story that we don't need to be told things all that much. We can see what's happening and still get it. Right? We're going to have a visual say just as much or more sometimes than dialogue can. So the best way to approach voiceover is, for one, it's a part of the whole story. Like you keep it there. And every now and then he's breaking off into voiceover or something. And it happens throughout. Again, a lot depends on genre, because if you're writing some, like a movie like Enchanted or a Disney movie or something, you might have bookends because it's just part of the feel, right? It's like a book. But voiceover, the best voiceover is commentary. You see a character sitting at her cubicle and she looks exhausted and you have terrible lighting and she's staring at her screen. She's got bags under her eyes, and the voiceover says something, "I lead the most exciting life." That's funny because what we are seeing is completely different from what's going on inside of the character's head. That's when voiceover can be a lot of fun. But if voiceover is talking about what we're seeing, it starts to go into telling and exposition, and it's like, why are you saying that to me when I can just see what's happening? So I don't mean to be so stark when it comes to voiceover, but it's a little bit of a pet peeve because voiceover can be great, like really good. Juno is a perfect example of really good voiceover because the writer had a strong voice and they're commenting on all that in terms of what they're seeing. So be careful with voiceover. Try to find some movies, maybe even Google, great voiceover in movies or something, and try to watch those movies and see what they do. It's all about studying and educating yourself. And, it's a good question though, Mark, because a lot of writers ask that. What about voiceover? All right, so I said I was going to give a little discount. Pushing Daisies, really good example. Pushing Daisies, yeah. Scorsese he does everything right, generally speaking. All right, so if you want my course, you can go to thecraftcourse.com. It's an actual separate site. You don't go to the ISA website, even though this is sanctioned and it's done and created by the International Screenwriters Association. But you go to the Craft Course and you go through the process of purchasing just the course called the Craft Course. There are a couple other options and things you can purchase there, but select the Craft Course and then go through the process of like you're buying it, but then enter a code, enter code, and I think they might call it a coupon. Coupon is just July ISA CC 50. July ISA CC 50, you get it for $49, and all the things I talked about today, I go into so much more detail, and it's not just through written stuff, like you can read it, but I also have audio transcriptions, I have some video explanations, and a whole bunch of assignments that if you follow diligently for 12 weeks, within 12 to 13 weeks, you'll have a pretty well-developed first draft done. And that's really where we need to be as writers. We need to be churning these projects out quickly so we don't spend 6 to 8 months, writing one script and then putting all of our eggs in that one basket. If we could write a script every 3 or 4 months, after a year, you've got 3 or 4 scripts, and you're not so married to one of them. You're like, wow, I have these 3 scripts that I actually kind of love. Let's write 2 or 3 more. It's just going to up my chances of someone discovering me. So have at it. Hopefully this was enjoyable. I wasn't attacked by the wasp, even though he's still up there. He's trying to get out. He's seeing the window, and he's like, why can't I get through? Anyway, enjoy the rest of your summer, everybody. We're going to have another one of these free webinars. I believe next time it may just be Connect only. I think we opened it up to all ISA members this time again, just because everything's going crazy again in the world. I hope that everyone just stays safe. Try not to go crazy with fear. Just manage this as best as you can. Stay in touch with your family. You know, do everything you can to have some fun, and then find time to write and just do your best to stay creative. But we're going to do this again next month. If you do want to be an ISAConnect member, go to networkisa.org. It's $10 a month. You get a lot more than just these classes, but let's go for it.